At Lenovo, the most powerful insight that we now apply, and I try to bring to my work and also with customers, is how do we take things that are automated perhaps very deeply, but not very broadly? And how do we use the process mindset to get out of those and actually think, how do we have a better whole? And so it's important to have an overall plan, as well as being able and willing to maintain that. Why does purposefully dissolving or loosening some of the boundaries so that people can work together pay dividends is because the beauty comes from focusing everyone on the customer. If you have an entire team that is working together day in and day out, shoulder by shoulder, you can't help but notice what is the critical path. There is no single right answer. And I see this a lot where people will focus on, oh, that other company does it way X, right? Whether that's federated, centralized, decentralized, or some mix. That risks just copying what other people are doing on the surface without understanding. What I like about the new automation mindset and these ways of looking at it is it helps each company better assess for yourself what makes sense.
Welcome to the new automation mindset, where AI, automation, and integration come together. I'm your host, Markus Zirn, and as Chief Strategy Officer and part of the founding executive team at Workato, it is my mission to find these top innovators in AI, automation, and integration and share their journeys with all of you. So today, I'm really excited to have with me Art Yu. He's the Senior Vice President, Global CIO, and SSG Chief Delivery and Technology Officer at Lenovo. That's a handful. And obviously, Lenovo, I guess everyone knows, $57 billion giant in the IT industry, and it really became famous with first acquisition of IBM's PC business, and then also IBM server division, and later also Motorola Mobility. So it's an amazing case study, East meets West coming together. We'll talk about that. I'm actually really curious about this myself. And then over the last couple years, Lenovo has diversified. So not just a hardware company, but also offering turnkey IT services, and Art is at the core of both of that. Actually, as this chief delivery and technology officer of that services business, and that in itself is about a $7 billion business. So huge in itself, could be its own company. So Arthur, thank you so much for joining us today. So what I'm actually really curious about, so I think you're in a great spot. You are basically running IT, but then you're also providing services for large IT organizations that are kind of like you in a way, also large enterprises. And if I think of my career, the best product managers I've encountered in my career, they came, basically they were customers of the product before, because when they see the product, they experience the product, they just have a complete different mastery. How has that influenced you as the CIO? It's almost like, how's that made you better at both jobs, I guess, in a way? Can you talk about maybe some examples, how you leverage that sweet spot being on both sides?
Yes, absolutely, Markus. So hello, everyone, to all of our listeners and viewers today. Thank you also for the generous introduction. Very happy to be here. So you point out something quite interesting, that I do have two hats, right? Obviously, the company thought I wasn't busy enough and wanted to make sure my life was exciting. But yes, it's actually very valuable to have that, because you are able to then have multiple perspectives. And I think that really enhances how you can have a full field of view. At Lenovo, right, I'm using our scale, our technology, and our resources across all of our global markets. And we do it enough. And I do it with my teams in the business that we also have a concept now, which we've explicitly called Lenovo Powers Lenovo. This actually tests our own solutions, now everyone, and including ourselves, enriched with AI to have that better speed, efficiency and responsiveness. And the great thing about this is it goes both ways. It helps Lenovo and it helps our customers because we are also a large global company, and the solutions we're implementing are also the ones that customers need. So, Markus, you mentioned some examples. For example, one of the things, because everyone is focused on operational efficiency, especially around how do you manage your hybrid AI, your hybrid cloud estate. And so recently, internally, we've actually built and expanded and developed a tool that's around the AI-powered ability to run the hybrid cloud. It's something we happen to call XSpark. And we noticed that we were actually able to improve our infrastructure engineering team's efficiency by 15% on a range of tasks. And as we started to talk with customers, we found that this was something that they were interested very much as well, right? Especially as we're building agents and the ability to better summarize work and automate many of the tasks. And so that's one area around our hybrid cloud, where being both a user as well as a customer pays dividends. Maybe something else also in a related sphere for IT, but slightly different, is around carbon emissions. Okay, so working closely with our teams around the company and product and supply chain, we are looking carefully at the IT lifecycle management. And we've applied to that very disparate and very large data set AI-powered sustainability engine, because it helps us be more data-driven about how we are looking about our carbon footprint all the way through our supply chain. And doing that for ourselves, which helped make Lenovo a top 10 supply chain globally, we also ended up developing something called LISA, right? The Lenovo Intelligent Sustainability Solution Advisor. And this helps customers the same way we're able to help ourselves look at their emissions across the IT lifecycle. So that's a couple of examples, Markus.
That was fascinating in itself already. I mean, you kind of went into all the different angles that I was expecting, right? I mean, obviously, so you're providing with the hybrid cloud that you mentioned, you're in that more IT processes kind of domain, right? And then you talked about the sustainability, that's the supply chain. That's actually both of the areas that I'm really curious about, where I feel like, you're going to provide leadership to the whole industry, if that makes sense. And then both examples seem to include Gen AI, or AI at least. And so that obviously is what we talk about these days. So let's go into each of these areas. We put out this book with the automation mindset. We talk about process mindset, growth mindset, scale mindset. Let's go into that first example, like IT processes, right? I mean, you providing with SSG, you providing IT services. You gave a great example with the hybrid cloud. What else is out there? What do you think, like from what you learned, running this yourself at Lenovo, and then also working with lots of other large customers? What are the areas of IT processes you feel, people out there can still do better at? Like, where's the opportunity in specifically IT processes? You mentioned the hybrid cloud. That's a big one. Anything else?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the user journey and journeys more broadly are a huge and very rich, and as of yet not fully mined area where there's a lot more value. I was actually rereading the book just to look at the framing, and I think the process, the growth, and the scale mindset, those three lenses give a really good way of looking at it more broadly. So we'll come back to the example, but I think what's even more useful when I think about the framing and how I've applied it and tried to match it with my experience with customers as well as within Lenovo is this notion of journey, right? And in some sense, we don't need to focus just on IT processes, because what was really striking is that the having an experience and a journey that can really serve as the integration that's needed. More and more, I think we are very good at specific local processes. I think the book refers to them as tasks. And there's a risk of going too deep on task, because if you equip everybody with the tools and they just become more and more focused in only their particular domain, in their corner of the world, what we call those silos. And so the most powerful insight that we now apply, and I try to bring to my work and also with customers, is how do we take things that are automated perhaps very deeply, but not very broadly? And how do we use the process mindset to get out of those and actually think, how do we have a better whole? Right? An analogy that we use is everyone is trying to build some kind of a highway. But unless you have that integrative either journey or experience that you're targeting, then you end up with this mishmash, right? The off-ramps might not be connected. Things don't actually work together very well. And so it's important to have an overall plan, and as well as being able and willing to maintain that. Right? So within IT, I think a good example of this that I found is around DevOps and this notion of how do we implement more agility. And as many of our listeners and viewers know, that's really founded around agility. And agility means we need to do things differently between teams or among teams that have historically worked in particular ways. For us, as a very simple example, we had two systems. We had a ticketing system, and then we had a service management system. And those represented two very different worlds. And each team was so sure that they had optimized the journeys for themselves of what they needed. But when you put them together, then you found that there was a lot of friction. And so to put it another way, Markus, around the process mindset, I think one of the huge values, for example, when you put together the development team and the infrastructure operations, so you get a better end-to-end and higher speed and shorter time to market, is actually you have to level up. By taking a process mindset and looking at a broader experience, it re-updates the optimization function. So what are you looking for? Is that the dev team works the best by themselves or the operations team? But by putting them together, you actually make the overall objective function very different. And so I think that was a very practical example of elevating the discussion using the process mindset to have a much better outcome. Maybe one other quick thing here, because it's such an interesting point around the growth mindset as well. I think what that speaks to is the need to change with the business. Right? Everyone knows that we don't live in a static world, but we are consistently grappling with how do we make it more seamless? How do we actually have a true learning organization? And here again, the importance is stepping out of just the IT processes. When you think about the growth mindset, the biggest point here is how do we, again, dissolve those traditional boundaries and shift the mindset from gatekeeper, so technology as a gatekeeper that manages handoffs, into a much more integrated team. And so there's a very simple visual test that I can do, which is if I look at a domain that's working on business technology, let's zoom out a little bit from the IT processes only. If I walk into a team and I cannot tell who's in which role, I can't tell who the product manager is, I can't tell who the tech lead is, I can't tell who the business process ownership is, that's a good team. Because that then has pulled together all these ingredients we need to be able to learn quickly. Right? If you have someone who's so clearly, well, I'm just thinking about what's going to come next, and maybe I'll hand it off to someone who's a technologist who does something and they test it and bring it back, that's going to extend the lead times. But when you put those teams together and you look at it holistically, you're extending the boundaries and you're encompassing more boundaries with fewer handoffs. And I think that's a great way of driving the business and the technology teams together.
You talked about so many things that really matter to me. I mean, you and I, we both have one thing in common. Like, we had strategy consulting experience before, and this whole journey mapping. We were actually together with the partner responsible for the distribution industry at McKinsey worldwide the other day, and there were a lot of conversations around journey mapping. I used to do business process reengineering, but you're absolutely right. I think that overarching end-to-end process often is overlooked. I mean, I think we tend to, I guess, organizationally or as humans, we tend to, we want to carve out what we're responsible for. And then so we're always looking for almost like local optima, if that makes sense. But then you need to kind of look across the overall thing. You kind of actually said something really interesting, maybe something a little counterintuitive also. You said when I look in there and I don't see someone who, if everyone's responsible, I think that's the best situation, right? Did I get that right? So you basically said if I don't need someone to pull it all together, then probably it's the most agile because everyone pitches in, and I guess it's more organic. Is that what you were trying to say?
So yes, it is a bit counterintuitive, although I think we need to be careful to make sure people understand that it's not chaotic, right? Right, that it's managed. So it's opening up the aperture a bit about how teams work. And I think just for the purposes of illustration, if you imagine a traditional waterfall, very clearly defined handoffs at every boundary, that's very rigorous. But that rigor, you pay a penalty in terms of the overhead. When you have the teams working together, you are in fact, right, from a classical perspective, you are blurring some of those boundaries, right? Because you'd see teams that are then perhaps no longer 100% following a very, we'll call it classically rigorous process. But I think in our hyper-efficient focus, I think we need to remember not to over pivot on just the efficiency, right? We need to look at what is the overall outcome we are doing. So for example, if we just step back a few years, before COVID, I think efficiency had become this unmitigated good, right? Where more efficiency was always better. It was always positive. You could never go wrong going for more efficiency. And so with the rise of Lean, right, from Lean Six Sigma and very much focusing on how do you become hyper efficient. But when COVID happened, I think it was a stark reminder that these things are inherently neutral. That is to say, there's another side. Because when you are hyper efficient, then what happens is you have no shock absorbers, right? You have no buffer, right? Now, buffer isn't a bad thing, right? Because buffer is actually meant to insulate you from sudden changes. As we just talked about, the dynamism of business means that you have to be prepared. And if you are so hyper efficient, that's really another way of saying you are so specialized on something that is fixed. But if something changes, you may end up in a scramble. To bring it back, Markus, to your question of why would kind of mushing teams together, or not mushing because that implies a lack of rigor, but why does purposefully dissolving or loosening some of the boundaries so that people can work together pay dividends is because the beauty comes from focusing everyone on the customer. And what that means is if you have an entire team that is working together day in and day out, shoulder by shoulder, you can't help but notice what is the critical path. If there is a market trend that's developing, if customer feedback is coming in hot and heavy, there's nowhere to hide. If you are the product person, you see that. If you're the technology person sitting with the product person and it comes in, you see that. And so the beauty of this is then it says in the name of trading off a little bit of 100% efficiency and 100% process clarity, you become much more customer centric and focused on what is truly the shared objective function, right? Which is for all teams generally will be around helping grow the business and getting closer to the customer and providing a better experience.
No, I think you said that really well, and it also it makes sense, right? You mentioned business technology. I think, a lot of what we're talking about these days is these fusion teams also of IT people and operational people from the business. I think there is some overlap is a good thing. If everyone just looks at very narrowly their job, that I think the overall journey will be hard to get to. I think it makes total sense. It's really interesting because you reminded me, we're we're so quick to forget the whole COVID times. I mean, Lenovo, you guys must have, with your big supply chain, right? And manufacturing and, having obviously chips in the product and so on. You guys must have been quite affected there with the supply chain. Tell me a little bit what you learned from that experience. And also if you think about as an IT leader, as the CIO, right? Like, anything for the audience here to learn about supply chain processes? I mean, this is some of the most complex, I would assume, right? Processes, as you said, probably before COVID, like super optimized for efficiency, and then like a really bad event happens. What are you doing differently now? How are you thinking about this? What would you advise people to do if they're in a manufacturing business?
Yeah, so a couple of points come up around that, Markus. I think the first one is that these things can't happen overnight, right? So luckily, and we've been a top 10 supply chain, a high-tech supply chain for many years now. And so I can't emphasize enough that it's the result of purposeful long-term planning. Right? I think companies, for example, that have perhaps underinvested in their resiliency or underinvested in their network, probably found themselves in a very painful position for an extended period, because the buildup, especially of something that's supply chain, which is a combination of forward stocking locations, supplier relationships, systems, right? All these things that come together just need time. So I think the first is that this is a journey to be undertaken, not a point in time objective. And as Lenovo, we view ourselves not only as a technology company, but as the supply chain being so important, it took time. So that's the one. Secondly, when we saw that there was a shock in the marketplace with the onset of COVID, it made it easier, right? It was still painful, but I think we were cushioned then, for example, because we have a global network. We don't have all of our manufacturing in a single location. Not all of our suppliers are in a single geography. And so instead of saying, oh, well, we actually need to build out entirely new parts of our business, which would have been extremely painful, we were able to say, well, we need to very quickly, and in fact, more quickly than we'd ever done before, adjust the weights. We needed to then put demand in Europe, put demand in North America, put demand and figure out how to fulfill better in South America. But because we already had those pieces, it was easier having at least built out those roads, and then how do we widen them versus, oh, I guess we need to figure out which roads to build. So I think that's the point about resiliency, right? If you can actually have a global view, and that's part of the benefit of operating globally, right? It enables you to be more agile in responding. The second part is you cannot get away from the critical path and your critical constraint. And so ultimately, because there was such a large shock and it pulled in so much demand and the type of demand, the entire industry, not just Lenovo, ended up shorthanded. And there were instances for a short period of time where we would be gated not by a CPU, not by a high value component that you would normally think about, but there were models of machines that for months at a time, we were actually gated for lack of a 30-cent IC chip, right? And so you can't get away from the critical path and the critical constraints. And what that means then is the planning becomes ever more important. Right? We call it a supply chain. Right? It's actually more of a supply web, but regardless, what's upstream and makes the whole thing go smoothly is the extent to which you can plan well. Right? And I think something like COVID brought out the need that you need to plan both at the tactical level, and you need to have increasingly strategic discussions about how demand and supply get changed. And obviously, if you're forecasting the next week, 2 weeks, 13 weeks, it might be easier, but it reminds us at a strategic level, you need to always be thinking about the scenarios and some of these black swan events that may come in. And while you cannot, by definition, plan for the unknown, then the right way to do that is to plan scenarios and build in some of these strategic abilities so that if something were to happen, that at least the probability you're able to navigate that with less pain than you would have had you not gone through that is much higher. And I think that's what people need to keep in mind. And certainly we have. there has to be pain, right? Whenever there's such a big seismic shift in the demand and the market landscape, anyone who says they went through without any, they're just lying or they're playing an entirely different game. But I think the notion of there's tactical and then there's increasingly strategic things that you need to do on the planning side, whether it's from forecasting or to building out new capabilities to navigate some of those shocks and be those shock absorbers becomes critical.
So what's going through my mind here is in the IT world, there's a big discussion always around, what's my IT governance? Is it more centralized? Is it more federated? More distributed in a way? Specifically what we do, Workato, integration platform. Traditionally, it's a very centralized function in a company. And then what we've seen at Workato was that you run into bottlenecks, right? If you have a small team that knows integration really well, and then talking about the agility and so on, there's only so fast that team can work. And then, people these days are experimenting with more federated, more distributed governance models. That's what the scale mindset really is all about. It's kind of people scale in the company. I'm just curious. It seems like there's quite a bit of correlation with the supply chain, right? With supply chain thinking almost. Do you have any preference, or what's your thinking around that whole thing about centralized and federated, and how do you think about this?
Yeah, so the first is that there is no single right answer. And I see this a lot where people will focus on, that other company does it way X, right? Whether that's federated, centralized, decentralized, or some mix. And I think that risks just copying what other people are doing on the surface without understanding. So what I like also about the new automation mindset and these ways of looking at it is it helps each company better assess for yourself what makes sense. IT governance and the degree to which it's centralized is a means to an end. So let me just use Lenovo as an example. Because we have a physical supply chain and we run it globally, then many of our systems have to match that. It wouldn't make a lot of sense for we run a single global supply chain, but actually every country and every geography does whatever they want on forecasting. And so because of the physical supply chain we run, then around supply chain and around our businesses and the forecasting, we have to be highly centralized because otherwise you get a mismatch. So I think, Markus, the key question for a lot of companies is, well, how do we make sure that the IT governance first is matched with what the business is trying to do, right? If the CEO and the chairman says, I would like to run a single company, I want standardized processes, then if you run an entirely decentralized IT governance where every country, every region can have their own IT director and strategy, those things are going to be in conflict, and that's going to generate waste and friction. So that's the first thing. The second thing around it is, I think what you mentioned earlier is right. Rather than thinking about IT governance as a single thing, if you can actually break down what are the things that have to be centralized versus things that you're willing to devolve into the business units or the regions, that also is helpful in making sure you're likely to end up with the right fit. There might be certain policies around enterprise architecture that you want to centralize, but then you may actually devolve the execution into a place that's much more responsive to the needs of the business. So for us, again, because we've chosen and we run a global supply chain and an integrated company and a global go-to-market motion, one of the examples is one Lenovo, where we're trying to get more value out of our full stack IT solutions that then go to market in the same way. Well, based on the business context, then it makes a lot of sense to do more highly centralized investments so that we can drive that direction. The final thing here is that it's also perhaps not as binary, right, as you and I have been discussing, because there are degrees, right? If you can be more specific about what exactly are you centralizing versus federating versus decentralizing. It could be financial management. It could be the architecture. It could be application selection, it could be the outsourcing and how you want to execute. And so I think that's the final thing I would say. You have more levers than just a single monolithic question to be able to construct and shape the right governance between the technology and the business teams.
Yeah, so I guess it just like the cloud, it's probably going to be hybrid of some sort, central, decentralized, and kind of working together. Makes sense. Look, what I'm really curious about. So obviously, all of these decisions are difficult, right? How do you do this right? They have to be specific to your business. But then what you guys run is this global company that's also a really interesting mix between, I said, like East meets West, right? Coming together with the different cultures. I myself, I grew up in Germany. At Workato, most of my co-founders grew up in India, for example. That's an interesting cultural combination. I'm sure you're running into that too. Chinese, American, and whatever you mentioned. You're in Latin America, you're in Europe, and so on. How do you work in the different cultures in running like a global IT and also a services delivery organization? Any learnings there over the years?
Oh, so many. Actually, I'm now thinking back. So a couple of things. Right? I think there's always the standard in how we think about it. There is the outcomes of what we're trying to achieve, and the mistake we made early on is focusing overly. And I'm here because we're going to hit 20 years since the acquisition of IBM's PC division next year. Very early on, there was a lot of the storming. Right? How do we form and storm? And we found that in addition, it's not enough for teams that are very different to come together and just say, focus on the goal. I think the how you do so, the norms of how you behave, as well as some of the why, the mission and story are so important. Right? And we found because people had different ways of working, culture really meant normalizing some of the interfaces between how people should interact. Right? And that was worth the time because then it reduces the friction. When you have teams that have very little shared context, then you want to do everything that you can to bring them together. Right? So that's through the mission and the story. That's through kind of these working interfaces and these behavioral norms that we want to try and set. Because the more shared context that you give people, then the more time they're able to spend working together towards the outcome versus figuring out some of the norms and are we working or are we really saying the same thing. So that was an early on. Secondly, at this point in time, almost 20 years on, I think the degree to which we have to reinvest, because it's an organic entity that is the result and is the sum of all our collective actions. And so it's not enough to say, oh, we feel good about our culture now. Hopefully we can just coast on that. I think COVID, again, is a great reminder. Because of COVID, there were 2 to 3 years for our global teams where leaders were unable to travel to sites where they had significant numbers of team, right? Dozens and hundreds of team. And what we found is you actually saw kind of some creeping back of these frictions where perhaps the norms weren't as well understood anymore, or people just didn't feel that connection, right? And so those start to increase to the friction. So for example, I just had a number of my leaders in technology who hadn't seen their teams in some cases for more than 4 years for a variety of reasons. And it was an amazing event because there was a very clear before and after. Right? Because of course we're always listening to our employees and listening and looking at our operating model to see what's working well and what's not. And we had seen a creep up in some of our survey just around organizational bureaucracy, connection among the teams. And then after spending a week to renew some of those bonds, to clarify how to work together and just recommit to some of those relationships that bind us together, those things started going down immediately. Right? So you could see teams were happier. And I think that's, again, a reminder that why, among so many things, whether it's AI or cloud or even culture and the nature of work, the future has to be hybrid because you can get the benefit of being, for example, remote, right? But if you go too far, you may lose something on the other side. And so for us, this notion of needing to recommit, needing to reinvest, needing to maintain the programs and the culture over time of what is the We Are Lenovo culture is so important, because when you go too long without getting together, right? Some of the stories that form your shared context and that your shared past and make the team work well, those kind of fade in the institutional memory. And so every time you get together, I think you get a jolt of right, this is why I really enjoy working with the team I do, right? I'd forgotten how nice it was to appreciate these aspects. And so creating that shared context and creating the lore as part of the renewal is so important, not only to renew, but also to evolve that as the teams and the nature of what we do change.
Yeah, makes total sense, and feels very familiar to us at Workato also. I mean, again, I think there's a lot of things we have to almost like relearn after COVID. Workato went through a fairly big expansion during COVID, and it feels like you really have to work at that culture. You have to work culture globally. You have to work at that culture, regionally in a region to have something like a Workato culture in the region. Also, it does take work, and it takes maybe some of this fusing together that you mentioned, having a little overlap and feeling as like one entity rather than just having your specific siloed responsibilities. Fascinating. I'm just curious. So you obviously were part of this entire journey, really, right? I mean, you kind of lived through for now, 15 years,
Yes.
Roughly, right? 15 years through this entire a journey of Lenovo, which is a great one. Now, the last couple years, you added that new responsibility with the services organization, and you talked a little bit of, how it's really beneficial, kind of, bringing what you learned at Lenovo to your clients. Has any of that changed, you being a CIO? Like, is there anything that you do differently now as a CIO from also providing services to IT organization? I'm just curious.
Yes. This is actually one of the most interesting ones, because it's a sea change. It has been such an eye opener for me in ways that I did not expect. So let me pick a few of my favorite ones just on reflection here. The first I would pick actually is, because and for anyone who runs a technology team and delivers IT within a company, right? There's always feedback. You're always being given coaching moments on things you could be doing better, right? So people are never happy, and the team's like, "Oh, the business is very tough. We have very aggressive timelines, and very high quality standards and service level commitments." But relative to the marketplace, right? The first thing that's really different in my mind now is the difference between kind of getting coaching moments and improvement feedback from internal teams versus how customers can think of you. Because there's a very practical implementation, which is with a customer, an external customer, you don't have the power of monopoly, right? So now it's totally different. One is with an internal customer, they may be unhappy, maybe you miss something. Okay, how do we do better? The external customer can say, "Thank you very much, Art. I'm not going to renew next year. I'm going to go find someone else." And so when you realize you don't have the power of monopoly, you then have an entirely different mindset about how can you really go after, and you have a totally new level of incentive on making sure you're meeting your SLAs, and more importantly, that you're committing to and making sure that both the stakeholders and the users are happy. Right. And so I think that's been a very net positive for my IT organization, as I've also tried to make them have the same mindset of, when you serve Lenovo as a customer, that shouldn't be any different than when you serve an external customer who can decide not to renew with you. And so that's really interesting. And psychologically, it's been a journey for me, and I'm trying to drive that into the organization when people realize oh yeah, if we're not delivering, they don't have to work with us. Right? And that's something most IT teams never have to face because you're IT, you're always there. The second one is that it's opened up a whole new set of learnings, right? Because originally, part of the reason I got the role was that we were doing interesting things with IT that had relevance, and we were getting positive feedback from customers that they wanted to try. And so it was mostly, okay, how do we take the best of what we've done for ourselves as a top 10 global supply chain, as a Fortune 500, and bring that to our customers so they could benefit? What we started to find, and unexpectedly, was that in spending time with customers, that learning absolutely goes both ways. And you have to think about it and look for it, right? Because it's easy for teams to get into the not invented here syndrome, right? Just the things we do are great. I want to build, build, build. And that's the engineering mindset. They take pride, rightfully, in saying, I could build that, and I can make it have value. Well, the flip side of that is, well, should everything be built? And what can we learn from environments outside of our own? And as we've opened up our own eyes and become more open to this, I've had to train my team, which is when we're working with customers, there are absolutely things we will pick up, absolutely things that we'll be exposed to that have tremendous value because we didn't have that scenario, right? Or combined with another something we were thinking, it could be remixed into something valuable. So the fact that the customers also, when we partner with them, can be a huge source of insight is something that's now really working its way into the IT and the delivery teams. Right? And then finally, the whole point of kind of what I call horizontal benchmarking, I'll pick as my third favorite one, because the IT teams in the past didn't really, we were always challenged, well, how do we know you're doing a good job? Right? And now, as I'm delivering IT for Lenovo and for customers, it is so helpful, again, both ways, both to show customers what we're doing, and also when my chairman and CEO and the executive committee says, show us how IT is doing, I'm much more authoritative because I can say, I'm delivering IT in this excellent way across these metrics to Lenovo, and let me show you. That's one. But then the other part that comes together is, oh, by the way, this is exactly how I deliver for 100 other customers that are large, and we have a 95% plus renewal rate. And so I think there's just, at every step of the journey, there are these nuggets to go find that might seem small, but they're actually quite profound and actually lead to much better discussions about the business technology relationship and what we can do and how we're doing. So it's been a fascinating journey.
Yeah, it does. It does definitely feel so. It seems like, I mean, that, it didn't come to my mind, but that the fact that almost like, thinking about, okay, so what if the business could work with someone else, right? Losing that monopoly and just basically putting yourself in that mindset, because with clients, that's how it works. That can be, can deliver a whole new level of sharpness, if that makes sense. And it's probably a good kind of way for any CIO to almost like, even if it isn't the case for them in their company, to almost like put themselves in that situation and say like, oh, what would happen if the business could pick someone else? It's it's definitely sharpens the mind. I mean, exactly. Listen, this was super, super exciting. I could go on, and we could probably talk for hours here, but I think that just ending with that thought of like, hey, that business IT relationship and really from an ultimate customer perspective, that the business can choose, and thinking about this and thinking about IT in that perspective, I think that's a really a good point to end on, and I'm sure it'll make a lot of the IT leaders in the audience think here. So, Art, first of all, thank you so much. I know you got a busy day. You got lots of things to do. I think we learned that all. Run a big global IT organization. Run a big global service delivery organization. We talked about so much, about COVID and the supply chain and the IT processes and so on. So Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom.
A pleasure, Markus. I think your insightful questions also helped us have a good discussion. Appreciate it.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode. Please make sure to rate today's episode, leave us a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to the show so you will never miss an episode. I'll see you next time.